Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presentation on the Trident Alternative Review. It's an issue that has been awaiting a presentation for some time. It began in late last year when Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Right Honourable Douglas Alexander, undertook to chair that review. As you'll see from the biographical notes, he, in addition to his job as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, it will not be lost on you that he was Chief of Staff to Liberal leader Nick Clegg. He chaired the Manifesto Group, and so he's a man who has been at the heart of this thinking, and we're very pleased that he has chosen to come to us today to launch the outputs of that review. He will speak for about half an hour. We will then have half an hour question and answer, and the whole of the meeting from now until 1 o'clock will be on the record. So, without further ado, Mr. Alexander, sir.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction, and also to you, the members of the Royal United Services Institute, for hosting me here in your library today. For generations, this institute has expertly informed defence and security policy, and successive governments have had good reason to be grateful for your rigorous research and objective advice, and not least the current government. Much of the framework of the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review was informed by your analysis of the inheritance in defence that we faced and the difficult choices we would need to make. So let me take this opportunity first to pay tribute to the men and women of our armed forces whose service and sacrifice to our country is second to none. And I'm sure I also speak for all of us today in expressing great sadness over the deaths of 2 Army reservists during a training exercise in the Brecon Beacons at the weekend. And our thoughts, I'm sure, are all with the family and friends of those people at this difficult time. As the Minister responsible for negotiating the latest spending review, I can attest to the vigour and passion with which those who represent defence make their case. But I can also attest to the fact that those same people I work with on the SDSR and the spending review understand the necessity for the nation's economy to be strong. They recognise that our nation's defence is built on our nation's prosperity. As Cicero put it, finances are the sinews of war. Prosperity and security, these are the first-order responsibilities of government, and they are inextricably linked. It is almost impossible to have one without the other for any sustained period of time. To ensure both has required this government to take some very tough decisions. And I want to speak to you today about one of those tough decisions that still remains to be taken, the future of Britain's nuclear weapons policy. Today, the government has published this document, the Trident Alternatives Review. This is the most thorough review of nuclear systems and postures the UK has undertaken for decades, and it is the most comprehensive analysis ever made public. In this, it is groundbreaking. And more, this detailed and forensic analysis challenges conventional and outdated thinking about our nuclear posture. For the first time in a generation, the Trident Alternatives Review shows that there are credible and viable alternatives to the United Kingdom's current approach to nuclear deterrence. A different approach would allow the UK to contribute meaningfully to the new multilateral drive for disarmament initiated by President Obama, while maintaining our national security and our ultimate insurance policy against future threats. And it could allow long-term savings to be made against current plans, savings of about £4 billion over the life of the system. Now let me be clear, this does not change current government policy to maintain Britain's nuclear deterrent and prepare for a successor system. But it does mean that we can at last have an open and much more informed debate about what our nuclear weapons are for and how they should be deployed. And it provides us with a chance to change course before the main gate decision for a successor system is taken in 2016. And today I want to make the case for taking that opportunity. Trident, I believe, is the last unreformed bastion of Cold War thinking. Britain in the 21st century, almost a quarter of a century after the fall of the Berlin Wall, needs to think about nuclear deterrent and disarmament in a fresh way. We have a big decision to make in 2016, and this study shows that there are credible alternatives that don't compromise our security, but do allow us to move on from the Cold War. We can adapt our nuclear deterrence to the threats in the 21st century by ending 24-hour patrols when we don't need them and buying fewer submarines. That way, we can take a big step down the ladder of disarmament and keep our country safe. But before I make that case, let me set out how we've come to this decision point. Now, your founder, the Duke of Wellington, once said, "All the business of war, and indeed all the business of life, is the endeavour to find out what you don't know by what you do. Guessing what is at the other side of the hill, he called it. So in defence policy, there is a delicate balancing act to make. Ensuring our military forces are configured to tackle the threats of today while maintaining the flexibility to respond to the threats as they change. Making sure that we are prepared to face the future without sacrificing security and indeed prosperity in the present. In 2010, the new coalition government inherited a defence programme that was not fit for this twin purpose. First and most urgently, the finances of the defence programme were hopelessly out of balance. At that time, the black hole in the MOD budget by the end of the decade was more than 1 year's entire defence spending. Difficult and very uncomfortable decisions were taken as part of the SDSR process by the National Security Council and by the MOD itself, under the leadership of Liam Fox and Philip Hammond on the political side, and by General Sir David Richards and his Chiefs of Staff on the military side. But thanks to those difficult decisions, the defence budget is now back in balance and the programme on a firm 10-year footing. And I particularly want to pay tribute to Philip Hammond's work to permanently embed sound financial management in the defence budget. And it's because of this firm grip on the transformation of the MOD that the government is able to guarantee a real terms rise in the defence equipment and support budget from 2015 and have been able to make further savings in day-to-day spending without any further reductions in uniformed personnel. The test for the future will, of course, to maintain the new discipline, making sure that the procurement schedule brings the right platforms online to the right specifications on time and on budget. And that brings me to the second challenge we faced in 2010. Of course, the size, shape and configuration of Britain's conventional armed forces had changed quite radically since the end of the Cold War. But remnants of Cold War structure and thinking still exerted considerable influence. The overemphasis on heavy armour, the lack of a formal joint forces command, the basing pattern, with over 14,000 still based in Germany. The SDSR, underpinned by the national security strategy, throws off the last vestiges of Cold War thinking, reforming to face the new characteristics of warfare, rescaled to the requirements of Britain's security at a cost that our nation's finances can bear, and in the context of the UK's global role and responsibilities to our allies. But there was one area of policy that was not changed as part of the SDSR, one that remains unreformed, our nuclear weapons policy. Now, it's fair to say that the two parties in government, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, have very different approaches to this issue. The Conservatives supported the last Labour government's decision in 2006 to press ahead with the procurement of a like-for-like replacement for the Vanguard-class submarines to carry the Trident D5 missiles. Of course, there are heavyweight Conservative voices arguing for change, but the position adopted by that party in 2010 was that the decision had been taken and there was no need to revisit it as part of the SDSR. The Liberal Democrats, however, voted against like-for-like replacement in 2007 under the leadership of Sir Mingus Campbell. My party has argued that the decision was premature and that no serious consideration was made of alternative nuclear systems and postures that could provide long-term financial savings and be more suitable to the threat environment Britain faces now and in the future. Governing together requires that we understand and respect each other's position. So the coalition agreement set out our joint government policy. The nuclear deterrent will be maintained, initial plans for the successor will proceed, but that the process of renewing Trident would be scrutinised for value for money. The Liberal Democrats, of course, free to continue to make the case for alternatives. The value for money study led to an extension of the life of the current Vanguard-class submarines, a decrease in the number of warheads on board each submarine, and a decrease in the number of operational missiles on each submarine. The overall impact of these changes has been to save £1.2 billion and defer spending of up to £2 billion from 2010 to 2020. The study also identified 2016 as the date by which the main gate decision on Trident replacement should be taken. This timetable has opened the space for a debate on Trident's future, a debate that the Trident Alternatives review published today is designed to inform. This review was commissioned by the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister in May 2011, initially with Sir Nick Harvey as the Minister in charge. When I took over last autumn, I found a comprehensive and forensic analysis had been conceived by Sir Nick and was well underway. He deserves a huge share of the credit for this work. It has been taken forward under the auspices of the Cabinet Office, but with a cross-government team of expert civilian and military officials. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their hard work, for their commitment, and for their incisive analysis. During my visits to Aldermaston, Faslane and Coulport as part of the review, I met many of the submariners of the Royal Navy and the scientists, engineers, and other civilians who support them. They are some of Britain's hidden heroes, often unsung, who operate at the limits of human understanding and human endeavour. The sacrifice that they make and that their families make to maintain our nuclear weapons posture is enormous. But they face the task with a professionalism and dedication that is awesome in the true sense of the word. Seeing them in action gives me great confidence that if the next government were to change their mission, they would deliver it just as effectively, in the most efficient and militarily credible way. And it is my belief that the Trident Alternatives review provides the opportunity to do just that. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, let me say what the review has definitively not been about. First, it is not and never has been about short-term savings to help the government deal with the current deficit problem. It is possible that under some of the options, savings against current plans will start to accrue in the mid-2020s. But this is not about backfilling budgets in the next Parliament. Now, of course, just at the point when capital expenditure on Trident's successor reaches its height in the 2020s, other major projects will of course be competing for limited funds. So while cost is not the primary aspect when considering the future of the UK's nuclear capability, neither can competing pressures on the defence equipment budget be ignored. The review considered, therefore, the whole life costs of alternative approaches to 2060. Second, the review has not addressed the question of whether or not the UK should remain a nuclear weapons power. There is, of course, a respectable tradition in this country of opposition to nuclear weapons, and that argument will continue to be made. Indeed, no doubt some people will take the opportunity of the debate I'm launching today to make that case, but I don't intend to do so. Complete unilateral disarmament is not the stated policy of either the Liberal Democrats or the Conservative Party, for that matter. As we all know, in some parts of the world, we are not far from the possibility of a new round of nuclear proliferation. We do not know exactly what is at the other side of the hill, so it is right that the UK should retain some nuclear weapons capability. What is at issue today is not whether we should possess nuclear weapons, but how the scale and posture of our nuclear weapons capability can change. So the review was asked to answer three questions. First, are there credible alternatives to a submarine-based deterrent? Second, are there credible submarine-based alternatives to the current proposal? And third, are there alternative nuclear postures which could maintain credibility? The review has been thorough, detailed, extensive, and objective. So let me take you briefly through the alternatives considered. The analysis identifies specific combinations of platform, delivery vehicle, and warhead designed for detailed consideration, but excludes technologies that could not be ready by 2035. From a starting list of more than 700 potential options, the work was narrowed to consider a small number of credible and deliverable platforms and weapon systems. Variants of the current successor program of SSBN and Trident ballistic missiles are included in the analysis. In terms of alternative platforms, the review considered large aircraft, combat jets, surface ships, and multiple types of submarine, including dual role. In terms of alternative delivery systems, the final analysis was focused on two types of potential future cruise missiles, a subsonic stealthy cruise missile and a supersonic cruise missile, each carrying one nuclear warhead per missile. Warhead design issues were also considered. An assessment of the UK's ability to develop and deliver the alternative options showed that producing the warhead and its integration into a cruise missile or bomb would be the critical challenge. The reality is that the UK nuclear warhead programme is highly optimised around producing and maintaining warheads for the Trident missile. The review has found that moving to an alternative would add technical, financial, and schedule risk to the programme. Delivering a warhead and an alternative system would take at least 24 years, deliverable with some risk by around 2040. The crucial point is the review judged this warhead timescale to be longer than the Vanguard submarines can safely be operated. Now, could this gap be bridged? Of course, there are options. But when you look at the cost of alternative systems, it becomes clear that each cruise missile-based option includes an extra £10 billion on its price tag because of the need to bridge the gap. The bottom line is this, as written in the review. The analysis has shown there are alternatives to Trident, that would enable the UK to be capable of inflicting significant damage, such that most potential adversaries around the world would be deterred. And had they been seriously considered at the time of the Labour government's 2006 White Paper, there would not have been a gap to bridge. These options would have been considerably cheaper than a like-for-like replacement. The analysis shows that cruise missile-based options are militarily credible. The potential for a single platform for both conventional and nuclear weapons would be an advantage. But this is an argument for the very long term. From the perspective of 2013, the timescales and the likely gap involved make the argument much weaker than it would have been in 2006. So my conclusion is that a replacement nuclear deterrent based on the current Trident system is the most cost-effective in the period that we are considering. Four-boat successor operating continuous-at-sea-deterrence is, though, not the only viable approach available to the UK. The review opens up a much greater opportunity for change in its consideration of alternative postures, and that in turn opens up the possibility of maintaining our nuclear weapons capability with fewer submarines. Taken together, this is where the real opportunity resides for making long-term savings, for recalibrating our nuclear weapons policy to the requirements of our age, and to contributing to nuclear disarmament. The analysis of the National Security Strategy, and indeed the SDSR, confirms the position that successive governments have adopted, and I quote, that no state currently has both the intent and the capability to threaten the independence or integrity of the UK. But we cannot dismiss the possibility that a major direct nuclear threat to the UK might re-emerge. With no hostile backdrop and a surprise attack against the UK highly unlikely, there are a number of viable and credible alternative postures the UK could adopt while maintaining nuclear deterrent capability that meets the needs of our national security. The review demonstrates that our current nuclear posture of continuous-at-sea deterrence is not the only one available to us. So let me briefly describe for you four of the alternative postures considered in the review, from highest to lowest readiness, and each of these, of course, represents a different rung on the nuclear ladder, down from CAS-D at the top. First, a posture of focused deterrence would maintain a continuous nuclear deterrent for a specific period and in response to a specific threat. At all other times, the system would adopt a reduced readiness level. And we considered three options for reduced readiness. First, a sustained deterrence posture would mean regular patrols which maintained deterrence capability, but the number of platforms could be reduced. Alternatively, a responsive posture would allow gaps of irregular frequency and length between deployment, so that a potential adversary could not predict when and for how long a gap in deployment might occur. Finally, a posture of preserved deterrence would hold forces at low readiness. No deterrent platforms would be regularly deployed on that posture, but the UK would maintain the ability to deploy if the context changed. The platforms might be deployed under that posture without nuclear weapons for training purposes and could conduct conventional duties as long as they could be made available for deterrent duties if required. The review clearly demonstrates that the concept of a ladder of nuclear capability and readiness is viable and credible, and that there are a number of options for taking steps down the rungs without getting off altogether. As described by the review's alternative postures, and indeed by Professor Malcolm Chalmers from this institution, these could include operating fewer Vanguard submarines, ending CAS-D for less frequent patrols, or unarmed patrols. Of course, coming down the ladder depends on three things. First, how we judge it best to sustain Britain's security in light of present and future threats. Second, how best Britain can contribute not just to our own security, but to that of our allies and international stability more generally. Third, how the decisions we make contribute to our legal and moral responsibility for nuclear disarmament under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So a word about the consequences I believe coming down the ladder would entail. Let me be clear, adopting a non-continuous posture does mean accepting a different calculation of risk than existed during the Cold War. But it is imperative also, I believe, that we update our calculation of risk. If CAS-D is an insurance policy, then we're paying too high a premium. The 2010 National Security Strategy considers state-on-state nuclear war as a second-tier threat. The argument that a current adversary would take the opportunity to target the UK during a period when no boat is covertly deployed and launch an overwhelming nuclear strike against Britain is frankly not supported by any analysis that I have seen. Nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. The consequences of use in the strategic context are, of course, world-ending. New scientific studies suggest the true scale of the humanitarian and climactic impact of firing a nuclear weapon is much greater than ever conceived before. Nuclear weapons have no military utility except as a deterrent against nuclear attack. That is the ultimate guarantee we often talk about. But the reality is that in the current circumstances and for the foreseeable future, that guarantee does not need to sit on a hair trigger. We can afford to go much further in de-alerting our nuclear deterrent. The option of non-continuous deterrence does not threaten current security, and by changing postures, we can reduce cost at the same time. For instance, ending CASD and procuring one less successor submarine would make a saving of about £4 billion over the life of the system. The judgment is where on the ladder you believe it is credible to stand, providing the ability to scale up or down as threats change, and the momentum of proliferation on the one hand and disarmament on the other shifts. As a recognised nuclear weapons state under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have an obligation to move towards a world in which nuclear weapons are no longer part of a state's security and defence postures. And it is true that Britain has made significant steps since the Cold War in disarmament terms. There have been regular reductions of the number of warheads and operational missiles. And there has been some progress in de-alerting, extending notice to fire, for instance. Britain has the smallest nuclear arsenal of any of the declared nuclear powers. Some would argue that Britain has done its bit for disarmament and we have reached the minimum level possible for nuclear deterrence to be credible before stepping off the ladder altogether. Now that argument has been deployed at every point we've scaled down over the last 20 years, but each time it has proven not to be true. The same argument will be made for maintaining continuous nuclear deterrence. But we seem to find that we have the ability to step down the nuclear ladder when we find the political will to do so. And the next big step down the ladder is to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in our defence policy itself. And that means accepting that a Cold War-style continuous deterrent has become unnecessary. Just last month in Berlin, President Obama called for movement beyond the Cold War nuclear postures and announced a major reduction in the US nuclear arsenal. It is my hope that in the next Parliament, the UK will answer that call with a serious consideration of ending continuous deterrence. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me sum up. The Trident Alternatives Review is the most comprehensive study on nuclear weapons platforms and postures ever published by the UK government. I believe that as large numbers of nuclear weapons remain and the risk of proliferation continues, it is right that the United Kingdom should retain a nuclear capability for as long as the global security situation makes that necessary. That capability should be scaled and deployed to the threat we face now and held as a contingency for the threats we may face in the future. And we should seek to balance the costs of this insurance policy against the other needs of defence and indeed other priorities across government. The conclusion I draw from the Trident Alternatives Review is that while alternatives exist, there is no new system available before the lives of the current Vanguard submarines come to an end that meets those criteria. And blame for this narrowing of options falls squarely at the feet of the previous Labour government. But there is a step down the nuclear ladder still available, ending 24-hour patrols and procuring fewer successor submarines, moving on from an outdated Cold War concept of deterrence to one fit for the world we inhabit. For the remainder of this Parliament, the coalition government's policy will remain as set out in the SDSR. We will maintain the strategic nuclear deterrent and preparations for a successor system will continue. But the final main gate decision as to whether to proceed with like-for-like replacement will take place in 2016, after the next general election. And it is therefore up to different political parties to decide the position they will take before that time. Liberal Democrats will be debating our position over the coming months, and we will settle our view at our autumn conference this September in Glasgow. But for the country, publication of this review today marks the start of a national debate on one of the most profound questions of our time. It will be the most informed debate we've ever been able to have, and I believe this review also presents an unparalleled opportunity for all political parties, and also for you, our security thinkers and experts. Let us move out of the orthodoxy that has stifled debate on nuclear weapons in this country. Let us seize this opportunity together. Thank you for listening.
Chief Secretary, thank you very much indeed. You said at the end there that this is part of a national debate and an informed debate, and that plays to both of the main boxes that we have to tick at RUSI, national discussions and informed discussions on sensitive and difficult issues. And thank you for that statement. It was I think there's a very extremely important thing said in that statement, and very important things not said. After so much speculation, what is not said is just as important as what is said, and that actually, I think, gives us a very clear statement of what the present thinking is, and thank you for that. So, we remain on the record. We have 30 minutes for question and answer. It would be helpful if you would identify yourself, please, when you ask a question. And just because of the acoustics in this room, and for other reasons as well, we do have microphones, and we will need to get a microphone around there. So, Julian Lewis, please, to start.
Thank you. Julian Lewis, former spokesman for the Conservative Party on the nuclear deterrent. You said, Danny, that a major threat might re-emerge over the 30-year lifespan of the system. If this happened, and we had only built 2 boats, we might need to go back to continuous-at-sea-deterrence, but we wouldn't have the boats to deal with it. How do you answer that?
Well, I would say that the options analysed in the review, in terms of the number of boats, we analysed in detail the option of going down to 3 boats. That's the option that is set out in the documentation. That would provide the ability on the alternative postures that are floated in the report to operate a so-called focused deterrence, whereby we would have the capability to sort of surge, if you like, to scale up to a continuous posture for a period of time in response to a specific threat. I think that is the right way to approach it. I think you could adopt a similar approach with 2 boats. So that was not an option that was explicitly analysed in the review, and I'm here to talk about the conclusions of the review today.
Okay, Lord Boyce.
Aaron Boyce, Chief Secretary, thank you for your presentation, and no surprise about your conclusion, but I no doubt you think it was worth the effort and the value of actually doing the study. Can I just congratulate you, by the way, in avoiding the trap that many other so-called authorities, such as Basic, keep on making about talking about Trident replacement. Of course, you were very careful not to say that. You're talking about Vanguard replacement, and it's a relief to hear someone at last actually getting it right for a change. I can't say I totally agree with you about the fact that the definition of deterrence has changed from Cold War to where we are today. Deterrence is deterrence. And I have to say that the conclusion you're reaching about not pursuing continuous-at-sea deterrence strips away the definition of deterrence. Deterrence should be available and viable all the time. And as soon as you have submarines locked up in harbour, whether you have 2 or 3 or 4, the fact is they're vulnerable to an attack, they're vulnerable to interference, and of course those who know Faz Lane know that exiting submarines from there through Roux Narrows is a challenge, even without interference. And most important of all, and you didn't mention this, is the capability and efficiency of the crew who've operated this system, the deterrent system, for 45 years brilliantly, without a second, without a stitch being dropped for a second in all that time. And I do not believe that you will be able to sustain that level of confidence in the crews. And people say, well, you can do this in simulators. You can't do it in simulators. I've been there and done it. You cannot simulate being under the water, coping with the oceans and so forth. And so I think that you will not have a deterrent if you do not have a deterrent which is continuously deployed, in which case, why have it at all? Because frankly, having half an answer is just simply not good enough. And I think that that is a really key question. And that really what you're also demonstrating is a lack of political will to actually use the deterrent if and when the time comes. So this actually is a step towards unilateral disarmament.
Well, firstly, thank you for your initial comment on terminological accuracy, which I hope to have maintained throughout this. And let me say that, as I said in my remarks, that having spent a lot of time on this review, including talking to many of the personnel that you have that you quite rightly referred to, as I said in my speech, I have an enormous amount of respect and admiration for the work that they do day in, day out, 365 days a year. But the conclusion I reached from that was that if a future government were to change the mission, that exactly the same expertise, creativity, ingenuity and hard work would be applied to ensure that a new posture would be delivered in the most militarily credible way possible. There's going to be a lot of disagreement in this debate, but I hope that that's a point on which we could agree. I would say, in a sense, what I'm suggesting here, is that we would take an approach in this space that is similar to the approach that we take to our conventional forces, raising the level of deployment in response to an assessment of the threat level. The current SDSR, the current national security strategy, makes clear that that state-on-state nuclear threats are a tier 2 threat, that we don't perceive that there are that threat is one that exists today in the sense in which you describe, and therefore I think it is sensible and prudent to adopt a lesser posture, but with the ability to return to a higher posture should that threat emerge. That's how we deploy our as you know much better than I do. That's how we deploy our conventional weapons, and I think that we could apply a similar approach to our deterrent, which is, as it were, the argument I'm setting out today.
Thank you. There's lots of journalists who want to speak and MPs, but you will get your chance, but I'm going to dilute you. Sir.
So, Paul Ingram, Executive Director of BASIC. Thank you, Lord Boyce, for mentioning us. I wanted to ask a little more detail as to why the two-boat option wasn't included. The last time I looked, we were a very loyal member of the NATO alliance, who were and have a great deal of faith in that. In fact, this is one of our significant contributions to the alliance security. Is it not the case that we should actually be thinking more in terms of our relationships with our allies into the long term? And when we look at uncertainty and insecurity and potential threats, we need to be looking at the ways in which we stay close to those allies. And so arguments around continuous-at-sea deterrence need to be in that context, and that we need to be thinking about continuous-at-sea deterrence on an alliance basis rather than on a national security basis, otherwise on a national alone basis. Otherwise, is this not saying we have no faith in our alliance? And what does that say to other states, both inside the alliance and others who may be actually looking at Britain's decisions here very, very closely as ways of justifying their own decisions when it comes to the acquisition of nuclear capabilities?
Thank you for the question, and there's sort of two parts. In relation to the first part, as I said earlier, we started out with a very long list of potential alternatives of all sorts. We had to narrow that list down to a small number to conduct the very, very detailed assessment on all the criteria that you would expect, calling on expert resources across Whitehall and beyond. And the three-boat option was the one that seemed, I think, before I took over the review, but also I confirmed this, to be the one that was most readily analysable in the framework that we had set out. Your second point is absolutely right, of course, that we do operate in this space in close concert with our allies. Nothing in the review or indeed anything that I said should be taken to question that. But the ultimate ability to act independently is also important to us, and the review is conducted on the basis of that assumption too.
Thank you. Bernard Jenkin.
Bernard Jenkin, former member of the Defence Committee and former Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, and now Chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee, where we've done a lot of work on strategic thinking. And I commend this paper for its thoroughness, but as in all the best arguments rest on premises, and it's the premises which I fear are flaky. And I have two questions. One is the two-boat option that's not in here. How much money would that actually save, and when? And is that significant enough to take the additional risk? And secondly, you've said now twice that state-on-state warfare is a second-tier threat. Can I remind you that actually the Arab uprising was regarded as a third-tier threat, and that the great danger of having these statements of threat assessments is that they turn out to be wrong, and indeed most wars turn out to be what we didn't expect. And indeed, the reason why state-on-state war is such a low threat at the moment is precisely because so many good countries like us have nuclear weapons. So how can you be so confident, particularly if we destabilize global deterrence by substantially changing our posture to a variable posture, which itself is going to be inflammatory under certain circumstances? How can you be so sure that state-on-state war will remain a second-tier threat?
Okay. So on the second point, I mean, I was quoting from our country's adopted national security strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review, which we undertook. But the premise of this is not to say that we should abandon nuclear deterrence altogether, because you're of course right to say that until such time as it is possible, and this is a very long time away, as President Obama said in his speech in Berlin recently, we can attain a world free of nuclear weapons, that having a deterrent is an important guarantor of security. So this is not premised on saying we should abandon nuclear deterrence. I think I made that very clear, my views on that very clear in my remarks. The suggestion is, and the analysis of the postures that we've conducted reflects this, that the way to be able to respond to changing threats in the future is to have the capacity to scale up your deterrent, the so-called sustained posture that we set out, or focused posture rather, that we set out in the review, which enables it to be scaled up to meet threats in the future should they emerge. I think that's a prudent and sensible way to go about that. In terms of a variable posture being inflammatory, that is an argument I've heard made, and it's actually addressed in the review, and you can see whether when you've had a chance to read it, whether you think that it covers that point adequately. I think you could equally well say that raising the threat level, going up to the focused deterrence, could be a sign of the country's resolve in response to a difficult situation, which could help in itself to resolve a crisis. So I think you can, depending on how you use it and the doctrine that's developed around a future alternative posture, I think you could deploy it in ways that aided the ability to resolve a crisis rather than inflaming one, as you suggested. Well, I accept that as a subject for debate.
Okay, I'll get some more journalists in now. Nick Ritchie.
Thank you.
And then Richard. Yes.
Nick Ritchie, University of York. Is it not true that this country has long accepted, formally accepted, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in 1996 that we would only ever consider using our nuclear weapons when the very survival of the state were at stake, and that defence review after defence review have told us since the end of the Cold War that we have faced no such military threat to the very survival of the state? That's over 20 years, nearly a third of the time we have been a nuclear weapon state. And therefore, should we not be considering relinquishing a nuclear weapons capability altogether?
Well, the first point you make, of course, is factually correct. But I don't, for the reasons I gave in my presentation, I'm not going to repeat them. I don't believe that is the appropriate conclusion to draw at this period in time. What the review is, the review, of course, wasn't asked to consider the option of complete unilateral disarmament. That is not one of the list of alternatives that we looked at, for the very simple reason that neither party in the coalition favours that option, and we don't favour it. Well, I'll allow Conservatives to speak for themselves, as many of them have been, and will continue to do, I'm sure. From a Liberal Democrat point of view, I don't think that would be a prudent response at all to the threat picture we face at the moment, and nor would it be an effective way of contributing to a wider move for gradual multilateral disarmament, and particularly the move towards the de-alerting of weapon systems around the world that is being championed in the United States and elsewhere. So I think this represents the best way to reconcile our need for a deterrent, which I believe in, with an ability to make a contribution to that process.
Okay, Richard Norton-Taylor, then Carol Walker, and then I'll go back to the back.
The Guardian, following on from that, are you saying that the credibility of a nuclear deterrence does not depend on CASD, or that the threat by the UK to launch nuclear weapons is not credible anyway?
I'm saying that there are alternative postures that one can adopt having a nuclear deterrent which are also credible.
Okay, thank you. Carol Walker.
Thank you. Carol Walker from the BBC. You said that your party will finalise its policy on this at the conference in the autumn, but given what you have said today, given your party's vote in the past against a like-for-like replacement, is this likely to be a red line issue in any future coalition discussions?
I think what I'm trying to set out today, and what I think this review does, by putting a very detailed set of information before the British public in a way that hasn't happened before, is to stimulate a much wider public debate on this subject. Today's not the end of that debate. I think today is the start of that debate. It's one, I think, that will go on in all political parties, and each party will have to think about what position it wants to take at the next election, and it will be for the British people to judge who they want to vote for at the next election, and the government will be formed following that. I'm not going to get into predictions about any what type of government might emerge after the next election. That will be a matter for the time.
Thank you. Malcolm Chalmers.
I had two related questions. The first was that you quoted a saving of £4 billion for the 3-boat option compared with the 4-boat option, which seems quite a bit higher than the graphs seem to indicate. It may be something to do with the pricing system or something. So
yes.
If you could
certainly
explain where the £4 billion comes from. But the related question is, if we were to go down the route which the Liberal Democrats, which you yourself favour, of a 3-boat option, would that affect the UK's nuclear posture or capabilities in the period before we have replacement submarines in place? Would you change what you do with the existing system, or is this something simply for what we do in 2030?
Firstly, the 4 billion figure is the cash savings year by year over the course of the life of the programme. The figures in the chart that you're referring to are given on a net present value basis. That's the difference between the two. The review considered alternatives. It wasn't considering what approach you might take with the existing submarines between now and then. My own personal view would be that if the political judgment of a future government was that adopting a different posture was the right thing to do, then it would make sense to do that from 2016 onwards, including with the existing Vanguard class submarines, and not wait until the successor was fully in place before making that change.
Thank you. Andrea Berger.
Hi, Andrea Berger. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute, and I was curious, in the opening of the review it mentions that you see 5 criteria that feed into credibility, and one of them is destructive power. And you mentioned already that over the past 15 years the British government has amended the number of nuclear weapons it feels are necessary to be deployed on a particular submarine, or the total number of deployed warheads in the UK. Do you think there's room to further amend that number?
Well, again, that was not a question that was particularly addressed in the review, though clearly, I mean, there are a range of options considered, each of which require, as the review states, different numbers of weapons to enable them to be deployable. And I think it would depend on a more detailed analysis if the government was to adopt this policy in future as to precisely how that question were answered.
Thank you. The gentleman in the white shirt next to Andrew. You caught my eye early on, sir.
John Woodcock, Member of Parliament for Barrow. Can I ask if the 4 billion savings figure which you mentioned from abandoning CASD, having a part-time deterrent and building fewer submarines factors in the need to bring forward any successor programme in Barrow Shipyard and across the supply chain? Because if you don't do that, of course, you leave a gap in the supply chain and you're faced with the prospect of the UK never being able to build submarines again.
The review, I mean, I don't necessarily accept your description of the proposal, but the review assumes that the UK government would wish, as we do, to maintain our sovereign submarine building capability, that we wouldn't want to end the capability in your constituency in the way that you describe. At the point at which any procurement of successor is completed, there will have to be a next generation of non-nuclear submarines in order to maintain capability. That is assumed as part of the review. There are, of course, additional costs as well to reducing the number of boats, because you're changing potentially contracts. That's part of the numerical calculation. But given that on any of these scenarios, once the successor procurement had been completed, that the next generation of submarines would need to then be procured to maintain that capability. That's one of the assumptions that lies behind the review.
Okay, thank you. Sir, sorry, we need to get a microphone to you. Could you just pass it along? Gentleman in the blue shirt. And then I'm going to Gerald Howarth after that.
Thanks. Tim Shipman from the Mail. Danny, two things. Are you saying it is Liberal Democrat policy to potentially have two boats, which has not been properly assessed by this exercise? But it is spelt out clearly in your widely leaked policy document. And secondarily, given that the Lib Dems' initial position was that you wanted something other than Trident, and you now appear to be adopting a position that you would have Trident scaled down, and that this exercise will not affect government policy, can you tell us how much it's cost the taxpayer to perform this apparently pointless survey?
Firstly, what we opposed was the like-for-like replacement, which means replacing 4 boats with 4 boats. We didn't set out at the time of our last election manifesto, or indeed during the debates we had at our party conference at that time, what alternative option we favoured, and what is coming forward from the review. And I stress what I'm publishing today is the review conducted by Cabinet Office officials and others, and not a statement of Liberal Democrat Party policy. The latter will be debated at our conference this autumn, and the result of that discussion will determine what our policy is going through to the next election. The conclusion of the review is that alternative options, such as, for example, the cruise missile-based system, are not credibly available to us from the perspective of 2013. It also shows that had those options been considered, and that's a factor of the timescales it takes to particularly procure and develop warheads for new weapon systems. Had those options been properly considered in 2006, they would have been available to us, and what's more, they would then have been cheaper than like-for-like replacement. That's a matter of some frustration to me, but it is where we are, and the review presents an accurate and factual analysis of those points. The small costs of this review have been met entirely from existing departmental budgets. There's been a small team of officials, small team of excellent officials, I should say, in the Cabinet Office, and drawing upon resources elsewhere in Whitehall and beyond as necessary. I would say that given the role this plays to inform what is, I think, one of the most important and profound debates that we can have as a country, I would say it's worth every penny.
Thank you. We'll get through as many questions as we can now. Gerald Howarth.
Gerald Howarth, former Defence Minister. Danny, you say in this report, none of these alternative systems and postures offers the same degree of resilience as the current posture of continuous-at-sea-deterrence, nor could they guarantee a prompt response in all circumstances. Now, what you've said today is that you effectively embraced the concept of a part-time deterrent, which you say should deter most adversaries. Perhaps you can spell out to us who you think will not be deterred, so that we have a clearer understanding. And following the point made by Admiral Lord Boyce, how long do you reckon it's going to take to work up any part-time system into a credible deterrent?
Well, firstly, I would say that, as is made clear, I think, on the first page of the review, that the analysis was a theoretical analysis of stylized scenarios rather than looking at particular examples, and we modelled alternatives that could overcome future defences that might be available around the world, and that wasn't constrained by any particular set of current thinking. And so I think that's an important point to bear in mind. In terms of how long it would take to work up, clearly we have to take a main gate decision in 2016, and I think that this review presents some very clear thinking that could be adopted in the next Parliament in advance of that decision. I think that working up the operation of a new posture would take a little bit of time. Working up.
If you've mothballed the capability because there's no perceived deterrence, how long do you reckon it would take to put that back onto the front line?
Well, this is none of the options here are about mothballing any capability. They are precisely modelled and costed on the basis that there are a range of postures which I described, and of course maintaining the training of personnel to operate the system and maintaining its ability to be deployed would be an important part of that, and that is featured and factored in to the costing. So the characterisation is wrong. It would of course take several years from the point of a decision to work up an alternative posture into one that was that could be delivered militarily. That's something that should a future government decide to accept that in the way that I hope it would, that would be a subject that would need to be taken on by the military and other experts who currently deliver our deterrent.
Thank you. Gentlemen,
Christopher Watson, British Pugwash. I've been disappointed at the lack of discussion of the implications of your report for the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You mentioned that Britain has taken some steps which can be interpreted as contributing to our obligations under that treaty, but the non-aligned nations particularly, looking at what Britain is now engaged in, will surely feel that reduction from 4 submarines to 2 is not really in accordance with the spirit, not to say the letter, of the treaty. Do you have any comments on that?
All of the options have been modelled within the existing legal obligations that we've signed up to and that we operate under, and I think they're all consistent with operating in line with our legal and treaty obligations. I think the central concept here, though, is about the ladder of disarmament, if you like. Are there further steps down that ladder that the UK could take while maintaining a credible deterrent that could be escalated to meet a future threat were that to be needed? I would hope that those who are interested in the questions that you answer that you ask would see what is suggested here as a set of credible steps that are available to us within the current system that would help us to show that we continue to be willing to play a part in the steps towards a disarmament that many other people around the world, including President Obama, have been talking about.
We've got 5 minutes left, Chief Secretary. With your permission, I'll take 3 final questions and ask you to respond to them as you like.
Okay.
So, and then we'll go to Tom Coughlin and then Samin Campbell. Those are my last 3 on the list. I'm sorry about other people. Sir.
Thank you. Kieran Stacey from the Financial Times. Chief Secretary, you say that going to 3 submarines would mean abandoning CASD. There are some that say you could go to 3 submarines and keep CASD. Has that been completely ruled out by this review?
Okay, thanks. If you give the microphone to Tom Coughlin and then Samin.
Thank you. Factoring in the additional costs of bringing forward the next generation of Astute, which you've referred to, how much would you save per year on going down to a 3-boat option?
Okay, thank you. Samin.
I'll try to resist the temptation to give you a slow full toss on the leg stump. How far was...
I'll try and avoid the opportunity of missing it.
We've got a fielder in the deep, don't worry. How far was account taken of the history of the 4-boat deterrent, which was conceived of course, in the time of the Warsaw Pact, was still live and active, when Russian tank commanders were alleged to say they could get to the Channel ports in 48 hours. And the profile being adopted by Russia was by no means of the same description as it is now. And the other point, if I may, how far was this review influenced by the fact that 25, 26 years ago, we had nuclear artillery shells, we abandoned those. We had nuclear depth charges, we abandoned those. We had free-fall bombs. So one of the first things done by John Reed when he became Minister for the Armed Forces was to abandon the WE-177. have you taken into account, first of all, the origin, but secondly, the activity which has followed in the last 25 years before reaching the conclusions you have?
Okay, I'll try briefly to answer those three. In terms of the question from Kieran, I think again, that's not an option that's been explicitly examined in great detail as part of this study. My view would be that that you would have, with a fewer number of submarines, a considerably higher risk against your ability to maintain a continuous posture with that number of platforms. In terms of additional cost and how much per year, of course, the cost savings, I think a sort of per year average is not very helpful here because, as I said in my remarks earlier, actually the cost savings come from the mid-2020s onwards, when the costs of procurement of successor are at their height. In those years, the savings would potentially be quite considerable. And the sort of cash figure accumulated over the period is about £4 billion. Now, that is a sort of modest proportion, if you like, of the total amount of money we spend on defence. On the other hand, as Chief Secretary, if someone came to me and said they'd identified a way to save £4 billion over a number of years, it's certainly not an amount of money that I think anyone would want to turn their noses up at, but it is a considerable sum of money accumulated over those years. In an answer to Sir Ming's questions, yes, we very much did take into account the history, and in a sense, I think that is the central burden of the argument that I am seeking to make, that the change in posture is one that is an appropriate response to the changing circumstances, that the threats that we faced in the Cold War, when this policy was first determined, are very, very different to the threats we face now. I've set out why I think that is. And that, in a sense, what the review shows is that there are credible alternatives that don't compromise our security, but do allow us to move on from the Cold War. And that we can adapt our deterrent to the threats of the 21st century, by ending 24-hour patrols when we don't need them, but being able to bring them back when we think we do, and therefore by buying fewer submarines. And that way I think we can combine keeping our country safe with taking a big step down the ladder of disarmament. And yes, account has been taken, of course, of the previous steps to reduce and get down to the single platform that we have today. That has been part of the discussions that we've had. Thank you all very much indeed.
Chief Secretary, thank you very much indeed. The concept of deterrence is existential. It is always philosophical. The issue is how does it apply to political circumstances at any given time. And I don't think any of us would dispute the fact that political circumstances have changed immeasurably in the last 20 years. So this is a serious discussion to have. And the review, as the Chief Secretary said, is part of a national and hopefully well-informed debate. I think we've got that debate started very well today. This institute has debated, and if you look at the pages of the Russia journalists, debated the importance of dreadnoughts, the use of blitzkrieg. It's debated the beginnings of nuclear warfare. It's debated some of the key moments in détente during the Cold War. And I suspect that this debate will go down as the beginnings of another debate of equal importance as we try to assess how we measure this existential concept of deterrence, which is inherent, that's why it's existential, but applied to a different set of political circumstances. It's an important debate to have, and I'm very pleased that we're able to start this part of it off here today. So, Chief Secretary, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and for your the candid way in which you answered all the questions. Thank you very much indeed.